Good morning, my friends. Welcome, everyone. So happy you're here. A little chilly out today. Definitely a second day of frost. Our cat seems to be pretty fetchy this morning. She keeps trying to tell us to make it warmer in the house. And I said, sweetheart, that's just the time of year. Um, so I hope you're staying warm, and I hope that our study will warm you from the inside out. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. And so, in the spirit of immersing ourselves, the first thing we must do is dive right in. Um, we have been reading a sequence of statements by Rabbi Akiva, the most renowned of the Mishnaic sages. And that is why when the text says he used to say, we are still referring to the same speaker as in the previous Mishnayot, previous teachings. We spent the last portion of our session a week ago on one of the most challenging and cryptic and rich of the statements in Pirkei Avot, the one at the top of the screen that reads, everything is foreseen, yet freedom of choice is granted. If you haven't yet had a chance, and we're not here last week, but if you haven't had a chance to view the lesson, I think it would be beneficial just because this is really one of the signature statements of Rabbinic Judaism. It's about so much more than just its immediate context in Pirkei Avot. It really gives you a window into how the rabbis choose to view the world. On the one hand, lifting up an omniscient God, and on the other hand, lifting up a theme that is going to be reinforced in the Mishnayot that we are going to study today, that our choices matter, that our choices are of great consequence. And trying to hold those two ideas of an omniscient, maybe even an omnipotent God, omniscient meaning all-seeing or all-knowing, and omnipotent, meaning all powerful, a God who can do anything, who has the power to do any and all things. How can one reconcile that view of a God against what Judaism also repeatedly affirms in our sacred texts and in our worldview, our philosophy, as it were, which is that our deeds matter and that we can make those deeds as free will decisions. So those are two themes that when you juxtapose them the way this short text does, that we looked at last week, right up here, everything is foreseen, yet freedom of choice is granted, you create a kind of paradox that I think is one of the most meaningful veins to mine as we study, again, not just Pirkei Avot, but you want to get a sense of, well, what is Judaism all about? How does Judaism think about the role of the human being in the world in relationship to God? This is one of the core texts that one would need to study. So hold that in mind because it does link to the subsequent texts, I think, in a meaningful way, the ones that we are going to encounter today. So we're going to start with Pirkei Avot 3:16. Hu haya omer, he used to say. Again, Rabbi Akiva, the previous speaker. Hakol, this is a very complicated Mishnah, by the way. I'm coming to this class with a little bit of an institutional advantage, not just because I'm the rabbi, but because I chose to study this Mishnah with my 11th and 12th grade advanced learners last night around the Rabbi's Table, which is the name of the Bauman Scholars Initiative that was dedicated a few years ago in memory of our congregant Sam Bauman, who died right around Thanksgiving 2017. And so I'm really grateful to the family of Sam Bauman, Zichrono Livracha, may his memory be for a blessing. Sam was one of our most fearless and brilliant learners that I've ever had the privilege of studying with. And he died of suicide at the age of 23. And his family has memorialized his incredible gifts of heart and mind and spirit in the Bauman Scholars Program at WRT. So I was studying with my my budding Bauman scholars last night, these wonderful 11th and 12th grade students, and this was the text we decided to unpack, and I came to it cold. I mean, I probably haven't studied it in, 20 years or more, and I just said, let's see if we can figure out what this is talking about, because it's the whole thing is an allegory. So let's go. Hu haya omer, he used to say, Hakol natun be'eravon. Everything is given on pledge, or as they say here, against a pledge. And if you're a Hebrew fan, you might recognize that the root of the word for pledge, eravon, is the word erev. Ayin, resh, bet. And I'm floating my cursor over those three letters here. This is a prefix, the b, which means on or with. Ayin, resh, bet is the three-letter root. We talked about Hebrew. Most Hebrew words are derived from three-letter shorashim or roots, and on at the end is clearly just a suffix. So if you know a little bit about the function of Hebrew and Hebrew words, you can unpack the word as something to do with erev. I think most of us are familiar with the word erev. Anyone want to just give your best shot translation at the word erev?
Well, it's either the boundary that we have or it's evening.
Okay, great. So Alan recognizes the same root from two different, apparently di different contexts, right? Really not similar. In eruv, from the same root, ayin resh vav bet, but the vav is kind of an interloper. Ayin resh vav bet, and eruv is the boundary that demarcates one person's territory from another, or one public domain from another public domain, or a public domain from a private domain. Typically, it demarcates the boundary around which or in which an Orthodox Jew may travel on foot on the Sabbath. So that's the idea. Past the Eruv, you are going from one domain to the next. But an Eruv makes it possible to travel within a certain distance on the Sabbath on foot without violating the traditional Shabbat restriction against going from one domain to another or carrying. There are all sorts of traditional prohibitions. You may be aware that there is a physical eruv. It is a cord that is stretched out over trees and telephone poles, demarcating where our friends from, for instance, Young Israel of Scarsdale may walk on the Sabbath, and notably includes Westchester Reformed Temple. And some of you may be familiar with the story behind that. Rabbi Rick Jacobs used to share that because of his friendship and collegial partnership with the late Rabbi Jacob Rubenstein, Zichrono Livracha, who died in that tragic house fire during Pesach, I think in 2008 it might have been, along with his wife, the Rebbetzin Debbie Rubenstein, Zichrona Livracha. Rabbi Jacobs and Rabbi Rubenstein had a wonderful friendship and partnership, and it was Rabbi Rubenstein's insistence that the Eruv, as it was being drawn for the Orthodox community of Scarsdale / New Rochelle, ought to include Westchester Reformed Temple so that members of that congregation could walk on Shabbos to WRT if they had need to or desire to pray with their Reformed Jewish neighbors. So it's very technical, but it's actually a very powerful demonstration of Jewish unity. So that's the Eruv. And then, of course, the other more simple, more familiar meaning, perhaps, of Erev is evening time. Okay, so now we have a very confusing philological conundrum for us here. We have a root that is related to the word for evening. It is related to the word for the boundary between domains, and it is translated here as a pledge. Anyone want to give me any other associations that you have with the same root, ayin resh bet, eruv, or erev? I'll throw one more out because it may be familiar to you. There's a phrase in the Talmud that comes up more than once and is usually conjugated as follows. Kol Yisrael arevin ze bazeh, or sometimes ze lazeh. Kol Yisrael, every Jew, or every Israelite, every member of the community of Israel, Yisrael, not the country, but the collective, the people. Kol Yisrael arevin, there's that word. Every Jew is blank, ze bazeh, one for the other. Or each Jew is blank for the other. Does anyone know how we would fill that in translation? Complete the phrase. Every Jew is blank for every other. It's You can take a wild guess here. Many of you have heard this phrase before. I'm not trying to create a trick question. Every Jew is blank for every other.
Responsible.
Responsible. Thank you. Right. Some of you shouted it out, and Audrey wrote it in the chat. Good. Thank you for your bravery. You are correct. I know there's always like a risk of being wrong, but great risks are worth it. So yes, every Jew is responsible for every other. So now we have this word erev, which also means responsible. So we have erev as evening, erev as related to the boundary between domains, erev related to the word pledge, and erev in arevin meaning responsible. And from that we get the Hebrew word for responsibility, even in modern Hebrew, is arevut. Arevut is responsibility, from the same root. And I'll give you one more. When the Israelites went forth from Egypt, in the book of Exodus, it is reported that they went up out of Egypt as a blank blank. They went up out of Egypt as a blank blank, describing the mass of people who went forth. Is anyone familiar with the phrase in English or in Hebrew? I'll give you the Hebrew. It tells you that in the Torah that the Israelites went forth out of Egypt as an Erev Rav. Rav is the Hebrew word in this case meaning big or great. Not the word for teacher, but I'll tell you a pun in a moment. So they went forth out of Egypt as a something something, an Erev
Multitude.
Rav.
Multitude.
A mixed multitude is usually the way it is translated, where multitude is Rav, meaning big, and Erev is the word that usually means mixed. So they went forth out of Egypt as an Erev Rav. On the subject of Erev Rav, as a pun, I promised you a pun, rabbis like to joke that the night before one is ordained a rabbi, you are an Erev Rav. Right? Rav is the Hebrew word not just for big, it also means Rav, meaning a rabbi or a teacher, a Rav, Rebbe. Erev meaning the night before, the evening, like Erev Rosh Hashanah is the night that starts or the night before the day of Rosh Hashanah. So an Erev Rav is the night before you become a rabbi. Or more broadly, a fifth-year rabbinic intern who works at WRT is colloquially referred to in our inside baseball lingo as, oh, Ariel was an Erev Rav. Like, yeah, she's almost a rabbi. Okay, but that's not a legit biblical translation. That's just punnery. So let's get back to Erev because we're spending a lot of time on one word, but it's a really important word in the context of this Mishnah. So Erev means evening, it means mixed, it means a pledge, it means responsible. What does Erev actually mean then? Like, how are we to understand this very strange root in Hebrew? How could it mean all of those things together? Somebody help me understand what one has to do with the other. How do all of these definitions connect? And you can kind of like just freewheel here. I'm not expecting you to have a tightly organized argument, but I'm curious how you see the pieces fitting together on the many meanings of Erev. Okay, Steve, go for it.
It's a word that seems to bridge connections.
Great.
Evening is between night and day, and and so on.
Right. So it has to do with something that sits on the boundary between two different things and therefore connects them. And you'll remember that in that way it functions very much, syntactically at least, or grammatically like another word that we studied at quite some length and depth last week, which was the word siyag, which means offense. And thanks, I believe, in my recollection, to Mara Steiner, we decided as a class that offense is not only something that divides, but also something that connects. Similarly, the word erev describes a state of mixed upness between two different things. Okay, so let's talk about erev as all mixed up. Evening time is the time on the boundary between what we recognize to be definitively as day and night. But there's a long gradient period, or a considerable period, that is neither one nor the other, at least not entirely. That period is the Erev period. It is the period that both connects day to night and separates day from night and is mixed up between day and night. Right? When it is twilight, is it day or is it night? It's neither and it is both at the same time. It is Erev. Okay. An Eruv does the same thing by demarcating a boundary between two domains, which of course are artificially defined, but by doing so, it actually gives clarity to an ambiguous situation. Am I in my domain or someone else's domain? Am I in private domain or public domain? How will I know when I'm on the boundary? We put up an Eruv, which clarifies the mixed upness between two domains which are arbitrary and invisible. Eruv in the sense, or Erev in the sense of responsible, arevin, one is responsible for the other. Colloquially, we would say in Judaism, one is all mixed up in someone else's business, right? And this is where Judaism is countercultural vis-a-vis American mores. In America, we have this wonderful ethos called mind your own business. It's a big part of American life, right? From Don't Tread on Me all the way to the present. Americans, I think, are very attached to the ethos of mind your own business. Not so much in Judaism. In Judaism, generally, it could be said, we have your business is my business. There is more of a doctrinal or dogmatic ethos in Judaism that makes it clear that the business of your neighbor is your business, that the community has a kind of integrity that is disintegrated when one is too much of the mind your own business. So, for instance, there are actually, you've probably heard of Good Samaritan laws, either from studying the news or history or law, or from watching the series finale of Seinfeld, which touched on this subject. What is the responsibility of a person who witnesses a crime? In most places in America, my understanding is not much. And here's where Russell, if he were here, would probably help us out. That you don't have a legal responsibility if you are a bystander to an infraction. However, in Israel, there is a law known as a Good Samaritan law, but in Hebrew it's called the Lo Ta'amod al Dam Re'echa law. Literally, do not stand idly by while your neighbor is bleeding. From Leviticus chapter 19, the so-called holiness code of the Torah. Thou shalt not stand idly by, is the name of the law. It's been on the books since, I believe, the year 2000. It was upheld by the Israeli Supreme Court. And it basically, in certain circumstances, makes it illegal for one who is in a position to stop or apprehend the commissioning of a crime to stand there and do nothing. Because in Judaism, Kol Yisrael arevin ze bazeh. Everyone's business is mixed up, is erev in everyone else's. That takes you to the translation of Erev Rav, the group that went out of Egypt rather, toward the promised land, as an Erev Rav, a mixed multitude, all mixed up. And finally, taking us back to Pirkei Avot, this illuminates how the word eravon means a pledge. Right? When you are mixed up in business with somebody else, you can effectuate a transaction by giving or taking something conditionally. Something is given or taken that must be returned or reclaimed. Therefore, a pledge is what effects a relationship or a transaction between two parties or two people where they now are mixed up in each other's business. They each have something that the other wants back, or needs in the present moment, right? I give you X on condition that I get X or X plus 10% or Y back in return. That's how a pledge functions. So it effectuates a condition of being erev, of being now you are tied to or mixed up in somebody else's affairs. You can't just extract yourself from the arrangement without giving back what you are holding, right? So it's like there's now a cord or an eruv that is both connecting you and also demarcating each person's individual responsibility. Oh, thank God Russell's here. He just joined from the waiting room. Okay, would anyone like to comment here either with a question or a clarifying remark? Seeing none. Great. Okay, let's go back to our text. So we've spent 20 minutes on one word, as we sometimes do in this class. Okay, so everyone can see the text on screen? I have the right tab up? Okay. Everything is given against a pledge, or I just prefer the phrase on pledge. By the way, we don't know what everything is, and I'm going to ask another few questions because the syntax here really intrigues me. Okay, everything is given on pledge. Mitsuda, which in this case means a net, like that which a fisherman, fisher person, or a hunter would use. Prusa, or prusa, which means to be spread out. Pores, you might know this from might know that root from ha-pores sukat shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'al Yerushalayim. That's from the end of the Hashkivenu prayer. Baruch atah Adonai ha-pores sukat shalom. Blessed are you, eternal God, the one who spreads out, pores, a sukat shalom, a shelter of peace, or a sukkah of peace. So in this case, a net is prusa. A net is spread out al kol hachayim, over all the living. Hachanut petucha, the store is open. Really, this is a good translation, by the way, all of this. The store is open. Vehachenvani, a chenvani is a Greek loan word that means the shopkeep, the storekeeper. Mekif extends credit. The shopkeeper extends credit. Vahapinkas patuach, and at the same time, there's no but in Hebrew, in Mishnaic Hebrew. There's just and. So the choice to translate and as but is an arbitrary one. So the store is open, the storekeeper extends credit, and the ledger is open. Vahapinkas, another Greek loanword, not related to the biblical character of Pinchas. This is Pinkas with a kuf. Hapinkas patuach. The ledger is open, the checkbook, or the credit ledger. We'll talk more about that. V'hayad kotevet. And the hand is writing, or the hand writes. V'kol harotze lilvot yavo v'yilveh. And anyone who wishes to borrow may come and borrow. All right, everyone see that? Everyone who wishes to borrow may come and borrow. This is one extended allegory or metaphor here. V'hagabaim, the collectors, in this case, gabaim, machazirim, tadir b'chol yom. So the gabaim, these collectors, go out around the place every day and they exact a fee, tadir b'chol yom. Okay, so the collectors go around exacting dues, it says, from man, or from humankind. V'nifra'in min ha'adam, and they exact from a person or from a human being, midato v'shelo midato, whether the person, here they say consent, it literally means with or without that person's knowledge. Idiomatically, whether or not you know it, the collectors, we'll talk about who these gabaim are, the collectors are going around to each and every person collecting dues, whether or not you know it or have consented to it. V'yesh lahem al ma sheyismochu, and they have that on which they can rely in their claims, as they translate it here. Pretty good translation. V'yesh lahem, they have, alma, that upon which they can trust or rely. In other words, the collectors are going around collecting what is owed to them. Whoever, we're going to talk about what all this means. I know it's confusing. Believe me, with my 11th and 12th graders, this was a real brain teaser. The collectors go about collecting what is owed to them, with or without a person's knowledge or consent, and they, meaning the collectors, have reliable information that what they are claiming is in fact due to them. That's what this means here. V'hadin din emet, and the judgment is a true judgment or a fair judgment. V'hadin din emet, we'll talk about this word din. It is related to the word dayan, like Moshe Dayan. Dayan is a judge, din is judgment or justice, or often translated as strict judgment. It is fair, it is entirely correct. It is related to what we say about God when we hear that a loved one has died. We say Baruch atah, it's the shortest blessing in Jewish life, or among the shortest. Baruch atah Adonai dayan ha'emet, just 5 words. Blessed is the eternal God, the righteous judge. And I'm referencing that blessing because it is directly related to the context in which we should understand this allegory. So the judgment is a true judgment, or a fair judgment. Vi hakol mitukan la seuda. And everything is being set out or prepared, mitukan, like from tikkun, to be fixed or prepared. Everything, hakol, mitukan, is prepared, la seuda, for a banquet or a feast. Or for the banquet, as it is translated here. All right, what the hell is this text all about? I'd like to keep it on the screen just because I think you will want it for reference as you meditate on the strangeness of this passage. I'm going to look in the chat window to see who else has commented here. Somebody asked, is this behind the Shabbat prayer for the evening? Yes. Anything that involves Erev in the context of time is referring to evening time, and there's also a prayer for establishing the Eruv, the boundaries before Shabbat begins. Pursa is also a piece of bread. Yes, it is related to a slice. The word that means to spread out also can refer to slice up, but that's going to take us down a rabbit hole that I don't want to go down. Arlene, comment. Unmute yourself, please. You have to unmute yourself.
Okay. I couldn't help but feel that I was sitting in services and we were talking instead about someone's life, and that there was going to be an accounting, and all of these people were keeping track of everything that you're doing. Everything is recorded, even when you think it's being missed. It's there. It's accountability.
Great. Brilliant. You remember correctly, I am sure. Because that is, I think, a most apt context in which to understand this Mishnah.
Okay.
Let's take Audrey's ball and run. Not Audrey. Let's take Arlene's. I mean, Audrey's ball is great too. Let's take Arlene's ball and run with it a bit, and assume that what we're really talking about is a statement about life and a statement about the relationship between the deeds that comprise our time on earth and the accountability for them that is being recorded, as it were, in a ledger by God. And what's fascinating to me, by the way, if you really want to get into a window into the sophistication with which the Jewish tradition talks about God and not beating it over your head, the whole Mishnah is phrased in the passive voice, like the one before it. Notice that Rabbi Akiva said up here, everything is foreseen. It does not say God sees everything. It does not literally propose an omniscient God. It implies an omniscient God. Everything is
Right.
foreseen.
Is foreseen.
Freedom of choice is granted. The world is judged. And here, the syntax, and I said a few minutes ago, the syntax matters here. Akiva goes on to say, everything is given against a pledge. A net is spread out over all the living. The store is open, or is opened. The storekeeper allows credit, but nowhere do we actually have God mentioned by name
Right.
or identified directly in this passage. What we have is a kind of philosophical statement about here's the way the world works, where the omniscient, omnipotent one is perhaps implied but never directly acknowledged. Fascinating, by the way. All right, I see my dad's hand. Let's get you.
Well, totally confused about a lot of this, but
Good.
I think that underpinning this is the conflict between free will and determinism. I think that it's making the case that your choices are free will choices. You cannot go and say, well, I had to do this because it was all laid out for me. It was all determined. What happened because that's the way it was written. Its counterclaim is that, in fact, you have your choices, but it's also saying that there are prices to be paid for each and every choice. You cannot say, I don't owe this debt because I didn't choose to take it.
Right.
It's arguing the opposite. And I think the end of the passage concludes with kind of a value statement and saying that if you make the right choices, there's a banquet there for you.
Great and great. Thank you.
The Torah choices are those that will lead to a banquet.
Yeah, so I want to confirm or affirm that, first of all, thank you. I really like your reading. And it is, I want to affirm that it is consistent with my reading of the text. The way I read this text, and again, so grateful that I got to study this with my 11th and 12th graders last night because they helped unlock some of the mysteries of this text. And it's one of the most challenging of all the Mishnayot and Pirkei Avot. But I think we arrived at those same conclusions which you've articulated in very nice summary form. One, it is indeed a continuation of the premise from the previous Mishnah. The world is judged, or freedom of choice is granted, the first important premise, and everything is in accordance with the preponderance of works. In other words, your deeds matter, and you will be judged or evaluated accordingly. And here, a direct continuation that if we assume that the entire metaphor of the creditor slash shopkeeper and the borrower is a continuation of the thesis that yes, everything may be foreseen by an omniscient or even omnipotent God, and at the same time your deeds are consequential, and therefore you are accountable for them or to God for them. Therefore, the last line makes a whole lot of sense, which was your other observation about this text, that at the end of the day, what we're really talking about is there's a banquet awaiting should you merit entry, right? So this is actually coming back to one of the core notions of rabbinic thought that we've explored before, which is that there's an olam, there's a temporal reality that we inhabit while we are alive in the physical, I am, walking, moving, breathing person phase of our existence. And there is an olam haba. There is a next phase of existence. I prefer that to world to come because, as I've said a few weeks ago, generally in Hebrew, olam connotes time more than space. Leolam va'ed means forever and ever. Literally to this olam and all, and the next. So I think that the banquet, and I know this from other contexts in rabbinic literature, the Olam Haba is likened to a banquet, and this phase of existence, in other words, the living, breathing, I'm a person phase that we call life, and remember, this begins with a statement about life. It says, Umitsuda prusa al kol hachayim, and that's a phrase we haven't unpacked yet, and we will. What is this business about the net being spread out over all the living? That opens this out, which is also inconsistent. It's a mixed metaphor with creditors, borrowers, and shopkeepers and consumers, right? So we have this kind of set of images or analogies drawn from the world of commerce, loans, pledges, shopping, borrowing, paying back. And then we have this one discordant image of a net, which comes from hunting or fishing. So we're going to have to figure out how those integrate or don't. That was where we got stymied last night, by the way. We still didn't come up with much great wisdom to say about the net, though I've had a few overnight thoughts. I woke up thinking about this text and what we wanted to say about it today, and I'll share in a few minutes, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts. But most of the text is not about the net. It's about the relationship between the borrower and the creditor, or between the human being, ha-adam, this word here, and God, who is portrayed variously as creditor, collector, and shopkeep. And they all are more or less analogous one to the other, right? They have something that is offered on loan to us. They, or God, in the role of creditor, shopkeeper, or even collector. But, as the great James Brown once said, it's time for the great payback, right? Do you know the song "The Payback" by James Brown? Go and listen to it. It's extra funky. It's on the soundtrack to a really good urban crime movie called Dead Presidents. I think it's the title track to Dead Presidents. It's "The Payback" by James Brown. Yeah, there's always a payback, right? So that's part of what this is about. But there's a consistent thread throughout rabbinic literature about this banquet business. So much so that I had a congregant who studies outside of WRT and at WRT with regularity, whose loved one was dying just a couple of weeks ago and has since died. And I actually spent part of my Monday conducting the funeral, the burial ritual for this very beloved person. And what this congregant wrote to me in the weeks when her loved one was approaching the end of life was fascinating because it signaled a deep familiarity with Jewish text and tradition. So the text that was written to me said, "Is it true that this is just the hallway and what we're really waiting for is the banquet?" And I looked at that text because it came out, I'm not making this up, by the way. It was a really jarring text. I knew this person was contemplating a loved one's death, which was imminent at that point. And I still have it. I saved it. I was just so struck by, wow, this person is deeply conversant with Jewish tradition. And it's the kind of questions that rabbis actually don't get that often, but that rabbis cherish when they do come our way. You may be curious what I wrote back. I said, "I don't know, but I do know that our tradition has shared that image in a way that many people experience as comforting. Do you?" And I just wrote back, do you find it comforting to think that everything that we're doing here and now is really just a prelude to the better stuff to come? My own grandmother, my dad's mom, Sally, talked about heaven. It is false that Jews do not believe in an afterlife. I hope that by now you've picked that up from our study of Mishnah. It is also false to say that Jews do or do not believe anything consistently and definitively. We have a wide range of creed within what can rightly be termed the Jewish tradition. It is also, I do think it is true to say that Jews do not place the same emphasis on the so-called banquet what comes after this earthly existence with nearly the same emphasis or seriousness with which, for instance, that consideration is a part of Christianity, right? Christianity, it is. So the way I generally talk about the issue of the afterlife, and I've taught classes, long form, like 8-week classes on Jewish views of afterlife. Some of you took them with me just a year and a half ago. I was teaching that curriculum fairly recently. The biggest difference in that regard between Jews and Christians, or between Judaism and Christianity, is that it is central to Christianity, and I would argue fairly strongly that it is, even when it is prominent, it is still peripheral within Judaism. Like, what happens after you die is a consideration within Judaism, but if you look at the totality of the Jewish religious civilization over the last 3,000 or 4,000 years, I don't think you can make the claim that the afterlife is central to living a Jewish life. Okay, Steve Maskett.
So just in response to that last comment, I think that my understanding is that in early, usually in the period that we're studying right now, the entire mitzvah system was for the purposes of achieving, getting to that banquet, which was in the Olam Haba.
Right.
What I was going to talk about was that very first sentence of the Mishnah, because it connects for me, it connects directly to the banquet.
Let's look at it together. So hold that thought, Steve. I'll bring it back up on the screen.
So the use of the word hakol in the first line, to me, reminds me of the prayer where we've, in the Reform movement, we've considered replacing hametim with hakol.
Right. In the Givurot prayer, the prayer that acknowledges God's omnipotence, God's power, we say, Ata gibor le'olam Adonai mechaye hakol ata rab lehoshia. Literally, you are mighty, O God, great is your saving power. And then it goes on to say, mechaye hakol ata rab lehoshia. We in the Reform movement substitute the traditional word metim for hakol, which means you give life to all. Mechaye hakol ata. You give life to all, Rav lehoshia. Rav meaning great. There's Rav again. Great is your hoshia, which means your ability to save, your salvation. But the traditional prayer says, Mechaye metim ata. Literally, you give life to the dead. Great is your power to save. And now you really get that salvation means something very different than the kind of namby-pamby, oh, I'm saved. No, it's literally like in the sense of bodily resurrection, that kind of salvation.
And in this Mishnah, hakol is directly linked with hachayim, the living.
Lovely. Great. I had some oatmeal while you were talking.
That's okay.
On the assumption you might go on longer than that.
I will go on longer. I can go on longer. So hakol and hachayim, hakol is either just in everything inanimate versus hachayim, or it's hakol is everything including hametim, which is different from hakol.
Yeah, I mean, I asked this of the kids last night, the students last night. What do they mean? Everything is given on pledge. Like, what's everything? Is it the material comforts we enjoy? Is it, the crops we grow? And the kids kept like running with this until finally somebody said, no, this is the sun got up in the morning, right? The reason you're here is because the sun decided to get up this morning, as it were. This is about existence, right? At some root level, what this text proposes is that you owe it all to a power beyond yourself. Life, death, everything. And that may illuminate for us the meaning of the net that is spread out over all the living. That in some way, although it is often invisible to us, if you extrapolate beyond all of the ways in which we are self-supporting, self-sustaining creatures and societies, and we as human beings have built an incredible architecture that could reasonably convince any one of us that we, again, are self-supporting and self-sustaining entities, at the end of the day, the fact that I am alive is attributable to forces far beyond my own power and my own volition, right? I'm alive because the sun decided to get up this morning. I'm alive because that nuclear furnace continues to shine. So I shouldn't fetch that it's a little chilly out, right? I mean, the sun is shining, therefore I exist. And if you want to call that God, call it God. I am alive because I am presently exchanging my molecules with the air that I need to breathe. And if I want to know exactly how connected I am to the rest of the universe, don't do this, but hold your breath for 4.5 minutes. Just, in other words, just stop exchanging your air molecules from inside your body with the ones outside your body, and you will quickly discover that you are not the self-contained, self-sustaining entity that you might think you are. That would be very punishing. Let's hear from Arlene, Russell, and my folks in that order, which is the order in which the hands popped up.
Jonathan, I was hoping that perhaps you could clarify when resurrection, bodily resurrection, took a backseat in Judaism, because apparently at the time that Jesus lived, it was very much part of the belief system.
Correct. So this will require just a short digression, and then if you want to learn more about it, I'm happy at some other point to go a little bit
Okay.
further into the weeds.
Sure.
The first question actually should be, when did it emerge in Judaism? Because there's no indication of any mainstream or even peripheral, like outside the mainstream, Jewish thought about resurrection until the book of Daniel. And the book of Daniel is widely agreed upon in the scholarly community to be the last of the biblical books to be written or collected in what we have as the Tanakh, or the Hebrew Bible. The book of Daniel runs up against the boundary of the Maccabean revolt, which we know was in the 170s BCE. So the book of Daniel is very, very late, early 2nd century, though like most biblical books, it is almost surely a composite work. Across its, I think, 12 chapters, you may have more than a century of compiled writing. So it may be 3rd century BCE into the 2nd century BCE. And that is the only book that appears to make reference to bodily resurrection. It is an idea that does seem to gain quite some traction. There are references in the books of Maccabees, which may not have been written at the time of the Maccabees, to the idea of martyrdom, in the hopes that if you martyr yourself for the cause of God and the right, that God will resurrect the dead. So the book of Maccabees refers to it. It seems to have continued to grow through and to the time of Jesus, so that we know that, the Jesus myth, and I don't use the word myth disparagingly, as any of you who've studied with me extensively know. I use the word myth simply to mean the master story. The Jesus myth is, of course, places resurrection at the center, and that is true by the time of Paul, the apostle and the chief press agent for Jesus, most of whose writings take place in the 50s of the 1st century. Not the 1950s, the original 50s, and is then reinforced in the gospel traditions, which begin to be written down in the 70s of the 1st century through the very beginning of the 2nd century of the Common Era, which, as you know, is concurrent with the compilation and composition of the Mishnah. And furthermore, I want to add here an important data point, which is that Rabbi Akiva is especially associated with promoting the idea of bodily resurrection in the rabbinic literature. And so this teaching is quite likely consistent with other texts that suggest that Akiva was a big believer in bodily resurrection, and it is why he greeted his martyrdom, his grisly martyrdom, which we described last week, at the hands of the Romans. He was one of the 10 martyrs that is recalled for blessing on the afternoon of Yom Kippur, why he greeted it so openly. because apparently the guy really believed in the banquet. And he was going to actually eat and drink at the banquet. It wasn't just floating around like, Casper the Friendly Ghost. So when did it fade? Well, there have always been sects of Judaism that have preserved the notion of bodily resurrection. And as Steve Maskett pointed out, references to bodily resurrection persist even in the tefillah, in the Amida prayer, in the statutory liturgy that is recited, 3 times a day. So it never really left. I would describe it more as there have been times where it has been more prevalent in Jewish writing and less prevalent. When you have time of great violence against Jewish people and Jewish communities and trauma, including times when martyrdom has been encouraged. For instance, during the pogroms of the Crusades, when Pope Urban sent his Christian faithful off to the Holy Land to reclaim the Holy Land from the barbarian Muslim hordes, he also participated in the willing commission of acts of violence against countless Jewish communities throughout Europe, because why wait till you get to the Holy Land to kill heathens when you can do so in your backyard in northern France? During those periods, you have poems and texts written by Jews that suggest that martyrdom was widespread in the belief that there was a better life, a bodily life, waiting for them in the hereafter. But again, by and large, martyrdom has been discouraged throughout the Jewish tradition. So, the real question is, I would frame it less as it was prominent and then faded, and more as it was actually always in the background, and just certain communities chose to preserve it in their literature. It's clear that Jewish discomfort with the idea of bodily resurrection was one factor that influenced why Jews did not broadly accept Jesus Christ as their Messiah figure, right? So the dominant story here is not why was resurrection so prominent and now it's not. The dominant story is that for Jews, resurrection never took center stage, and in fact may have been such an ideological turnoff for the for the Jewish community at the time of the early church, that it influenced why many Jews did not accept Christianity, much to the chagrin of the early church. Okay, that's a long answer, but thank you. Russell.
Well, that is a very interesting answer. I almost don't know where to begin, but I guess I'd like to begin first by responding to something Arlene's question. That is, if I'm going to be resurrected in this body, that is not much of a religious faith. Okay, I want a much better body if I'm being brought back to life for eternity.
Right.
I don't even want to talk about my arthritis in my big toe on my right foot. But going back to the passage itself, there are so many reasons to detest this Mishnah, the absolutely riotous and unprincipled use of mixed metaphors, first and foremost among them. How you get from nets to debtor-creditor relationships to banquets in a single sentence is appalling rhetoric. But what's even more appalling about it is that it seems as if our faith finds yet another way to demean human existence and to demean our relationship to God. I mean, we've been compared to flock of sheep with our shepherd, and so many other things. Here it's clearly a debtor-creditor relationship with these stealth debt collectors in our midst at all times. And yes, there's a banquet out there, but my question is there room for human dignity in this theology?
Thank you. I put myself as a spotlighted video side by side with you for our class, just so that people could see my reactions to your wonderful comments. I think that your comments point to one of the reasons why, or some of the reasons why, I have such a conflicted relationship with Rabbi Akiva. Look, I don't want to, I can't comment on what specifically Judaism or the rabbis generally believe about the place of human dignity, as opposed to the kind of we're not worthy framework that seems to inform this Mishnah. I'll speak only about this one rabbi and this one Mishnah. And I quite agree with you that I received this Mishnah with quite some discomfort, and yes, not least because of the mangled metaphors. As a fellow lover of language and the thoughtful construction of ideas in words, this one really, this one hurts my brain, right, and my heart a little bit. But even more, I think if we want to reflect back on what does this say, not so much about humankind, what does this say about the narrator, right? What does this say about Akiva's worldview? And what Akiva was dealing with. And I would just invite us to remember, we just remembered out loud Akiva's apparent willing martyrdom. The other factor I would bring up about Akiva's life that may or may not, but may be relevant here, is his vociferous endorsement of Bar Kokhba, this, renegade, violent revolutionary who thought that only 60 years after the fall of Masada and the destruction of the temple and the dissolution of, the Jewish polity and Jewish sovereignty once and for all, they thought that Bar Kokhba thought it would be a good idea to mount an armed insurrection against the Roman Empire again, which was catastrophic for the Jewish people. I mean, diaspora does not begin in the year 70. Well, it may begin in the year 70, but diaspora was the policy of the Roman Empire after the failed Bar Kokhba revolt, because the Romans were so pissed off at the Jews that they said, we're going to teach them a lesson once and for all. It was after Bar Kokhba that the Romans renamed the entire territory Palestina, as a thumb in the eye of the Jewish community to name the territory after the bitterest of enemies in the biblical record. I almost said the Palestinians, the Philistines. It was the failed Bar Kokhba revolt that led the Romans to restrict access to Jerusalem for Jews and rename Jerusalem Aelia Capitolina and replace the temple with a shrine to Jupiter. All of this may have been avoided had Bar Kokhba not had the backing of the most prominent rabbi of his time, who seemed to be inclined toward violent revolution against Rome because God is in charge of everything and we cannot accept the empire. So all I'm suggesting is that Akiva is venerated in the Jewish tradition, but I have some conflict in my relationship with Akiva because I believe that he empowered a violent insurrectionist to the vast suffering of his own people, largely because of his views about the relationship between God and humanity. And he may have said, well, what the hell does it matter anyway? If we all die fighting the Romans, we've got something better waiting for us in the hereafter. I would have been one of those guys going, I'm not sure that Akiva speaks for me. So, thank you for inviting these reflections. My dad and mom, you've got the next microphone.
I'm in the category here of being puzzled by the word net. I think that, it's like the Sesame Street game. One of these words just doesn't belong here. And we've got shopkeepers and we've got debts and we've got sort of merchandise implied. But a net is a hunter's tool. It's a snare. It's I'm sure that Akiva would have been familiar with gladiatorial games in which a net was an instrument to trap and ensnare your enemy. And so I'm trying to figure out what net has to do with all of this. And the only thing I've come up with is, if the postulate is that we are all in this relationship where we have free will and we make choices, but there is a price to be paid for every choice we make, what's the alternative view? The alternative view would be, it doesn't matter what you do because there's no consequence. Do whatever you want. If you can get away with it, that's fine and dandy. Just go ahead and do it. Nobody's keeping a ledger sheet. And if that's the case, that would really be outside of the rabbinic tradition of the way they viewed the world. Am I getting anywhere close on this, John?
I think so. I do think so. I went through some of the commentary last night on the net, and there seems to be a consistent view across at least the classical commentators that the net is a reference to both earthly afflictions and death. In other words, human beings or all living things are ensnared ultimately in a death trap that has been spun by God for all of us. It's a very grisly image. The one that came up for me actually is one of Russell's favorites, Jonathan Edwards' "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." Right? What, Russell? Can you just remind us what the central image of that sermon might be?
Well, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God" is written around the image of man as a spider,
Right.
being suspended over the flames of hell, and it is only God's, shall we say, somewhat finite compassion that is keeping him from, casting us into that. But there's so much other imagery there, like man returns to his sins like a dog to his vomit, which is so much better than anything in this passage from Mishnah. I mean, if you're going to mix your metaphors, at least have some fun.
Thank you. Yeah, I do think that the net is the kind of image that provides the framework here, at least the way Akiva is writing it, to suggest that we are all, at the end of the day, all mixed up together in thrall to the power of God. And that everything we do is happening inside the net. There is, and maybe that is also a play on the dialectic between
Yes, Libby.
free agency and free agency.
What?
Sorry, I'm muting. The dialectic in these conjoined or adjacent texts between free agency or free will and predestination, right? That on the one hand, yes, free will is affirmed. Your choices matter. You have to do all the things, so that when the collectors come after you for what's owed, your deeds will be weighed and you will gain entrance to the banquet. But at the same time, everything is happening in the context of this net where you actually have relatively limited range of movement. One more comment.
This is all a far cry from, the sheltering wings of the Shekhinah, isn't it?
Yeah. Like I said, I mean, some of this may shine a light on just the worldview of Akiva. It is consistent, I think, with his rather extreme political positions, about which I have spoken. Steve.
So I just want to throw out a contrarian view for the moment, because mixed metaphors somehow can have a place. And in this context, it really expands the sense of the allness of it, because it's all over the place. The concept of the mixed metaphor is part of it. And,
nice.
I think it works well. And I want to make one more
use of the word Erev in a very meta way.
Yeah, and then I just one more contrarian view here for Akiva. I wonder whether a temple standing or Jerusalem standing in the first century would have led to a Judaism that is as vibrant today as Athens. Athens is.
Yeah, right. I mean, exactly. Believe me, I, as a Reform rabbi and as a Reform Jew, I am grateful for the animating spirit of reform that allowed us to evolve out of the calamity of the destruction of the temple and the failed Bar Kokhba revolt.
Yeah. It was almost like it was the basic push to force the transition.
Right. But it's hard. I still have empathy for the suffering of the Jewish people at these moments of almost unthinkable trauma in our history. So
I'm not I don't.
Right. I mean, and if you really want to go to completely illogical extremes, would the UN have voted in for statehood for Israel had there not been a Shoah? that's a really bad analogy, but you kind of get where I'm going with how it can, yeah. Okay, thank you. So we're going to look at the next text, which is much simpler, even though it is long. A much simpler construct. So let's take a look here. I'm just going to close out my sidebar so that we don't have to, so I can enlarge the text. Yeah, here we go. All right, so this was number 16, 17. We're going to read it in English, and then when I need to, I'll go back and reference the Hebrew. So in different speaker. And again, you'll hear a different voice. You'll hear a very different rabbinic voice, just in the way Elazar ben Azariah speaks. And again, remember this wonderful feature that you can click on Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and get the comment on him that he's a fourth generation Tana, or later era Mishnaic sage from the first part of the 2nd century. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was among the scholars in Yavne, which was the original rabbinic commune established by Yochanan ben Zakkai at the time of the destruction of the temple. And he lived at the time of Rabban Gamliel. When the Sanhedrin, the Jewish court, temporarily deposed Rabban Gamliel, they installed Rabbi Elazar as his replacement. Beyond his scholarship, he was also known for great wealth and generosity. Okay, so that's a nice thing. Let's see what he had to say. Some of this may be familiar to you. This is one of the more quoted Pirkei Avot Mishnayot. Where there is no Torah, there is no right conduct. Where there is no right conduct, there is no Torah. And right conduct, im ein Torah, ein derech eretz. And we've looked at this phrase several times, literally the way of the world, but in this case it means common courtesy or right behavior, being a mensch. Derech eretz, if you really need a good translation, derech eretz just means that constellation of behaviors that amount to being a mensch. So where there is no Torah, there is no derech eretz. Im ein derech eretz, and conversely, where there is no common courtesy, where there is no menschlichkeit, where there is no derech eretz, ein Torah. Very, very simple phrase, but we'll get to unpack it. He continues in a similar construct. Where there is no wisdom, there is no fear of God. Where there is no fear of God, there is no wisdom. Hebrew, sorry for the fast scroll there. Im ein chokhmah, if there is no wisdom, or when there is no wisdom, ein yirah. It doesn't actually say fear of God, it just says no awe or reverence. Yirah is generally religious fear, veneration, reverence, or awe. Im ein yirah, when there is no religious fear or awe, ein chokhmah, there can be no wisdom. Continuing, where there is no understanding, there is no knowledge. Where there is no knowledge, there is no understanding. I think you're getting the formula here. The words are important. Im ein bina. Bina means deep comprehension. Ein da'at. Da'at just means knowledge, that which is accumulated, right? We used it in the previous Mishnah to mean the collectors come around and collect their debts with or without a person's da'at, being aware of something. So what's interesting, it says, if there is no understanding, there is no awareness, but im ein da'at ein bina. Without awareness, there can be no deep understanding. Yeah, this kind of like takes on the properties of a Zen koan. Probably the line that you may know best. Where there is no bread or flour, F-L-O-U-R, where there is no meal, where there is no bread, there is no Torah. Where there is no Torah, there is no bread. In Hebrew, ein kemach, ein Torah. Here it is. Im ein kemach, ein Torah. Im ein Torah, ein kemach. Without Torah, there can be no flour. Let us stop there, because that's the first big section. And I especially want, since I think the first 3 comments are more or less self-evident in their meaning, though if you have a comment or question on them, I'm happy to entertain it. Where there's no Torah, there's no right conduct. Where there is no derech eretz, there is no Torah. That's one. Where there is no chokhmah, wisdom, there is no yirah, fear of God. Where there is no yirah, there is no chokhmah. Where there is no bina, there is no da'at. Where there is no da'at, there is no bina. That's a set of 3 statements and its inverse that we can maybe hold off to the side. The one that really intrigues me, that I love, is clearly the only one that is figurative language. Ein kemach ein Torah, ein kemach. Im ein kemach ein Torah. Where there is no bread, there is no Torah. Where there is no Torah, there is no bread. Thoughts or comments, Russell?
Okay, well, I feel about this passage exactly the opposite of the way I feel
Good. Great.
about the last one. I love the collection of metaphors, and I love the transference between the sort of eternal and the transient, between the material and the non-material, how each supports the other. Without one, the other does not flourish. And in fact, this may even answer my previous question about where human dignity comes into the analysis. The Torah needs us to support it, just as we need the Torah to support us.
Thank you. Im ein kemach ein Torah, by the way, if there is no bread, there can be no Torah, is, I think, the prima facie argument in Judaism for why rabbis who care about the flourishing of Torah should also care about fundraising or philanthropy for the institutions in which they teach Torah. And Jewish communities, by the way. That, okay, you want there to be Torah? Then we need the bread. and I'm not just using bread in the sense of dollars, I'm using the sense of we need material support, we need material sustenance in order to provide spiritual sustenance. And then I love the fact that it includes also the inverse. On the other hand, without Torah, our material pursuits may be devoid of worth. Russell, was there a comment in furtherance of that point, or in?
No, you said it very well. Not the part about fundraising, but the idea that our physical sustenance and our worldly life are so interconnected with our spiritual sustenance, and the other way around, which is what I find most moving about this passage.
Lovely. Let's do in reverse order, Trish, Alan, and then Steve.
I just wondered, it seemed a little strange to me, since the structure is so very parallel, that why the second statement doesn't start with fear of God instead of with wisdom, or in the other way of looking at it, why the first statement doesn't start with right conduct instead of Torah. Everything else seems to move in the other direction. It seems like very carefully constructed, but that seems a little off to me.
Thank you. I don't have a great answer. I have an appreciation for the fact that you observed so closely this text, and that's going to give me some real thought. Like, why that order?
I'm afraid it's because I studied math as an undergraduate, and this is just.
Well, stick around for the remaining.
It's all equations.
Stick around for the remaining 15 minutes of class, because we're going to get to math, believe it or not. Alan?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that this pasuk, it comes directly to our brethren on the other side of the religious spectrum, the Chabadniks, because that's what Chabad stands for. It stands for wisdom, understanding, and knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And
Chabad, Chochma, Bina, Da'at. 3 words that have appeared in this text, by the way, are the acronym that comprise Chabad. Chabad is an acronym that means Chochma, wisdom, Bina, understanding, Da'at, knowledge, and they all have different valences or shades.
Just wanted to bring that out.
Glad you did. Steve Maskett.
I was wondering about the word kemach and whether it's an allusion to a relationship to God, and sort of another nod to the messianic constructs.
How so? That's a really provocative thought.
So bread and wine being those things, and turning into the wafer and the blood of Christ, all of that stuff comes out of this Mishnaic period. And so anytime I see bread and I see wine, I'm thinking that there is some allusion to a messianic connection.
Fascinating. My brain did not go there, and that would require a little bit more investigation on my part to see if that's in evidence anywhere else in the commentary. To my knowledge, no. To my knowledge, it's more to the point of bread in the physical, in the sense of physical, that which is physically sustaining, as a juxtaposition against or next to that which is spiritually sustaining. Because that's a theme we've talked about in Pirkei Avot before, right? We've talked about what is the extent to which a person should be engaged in secular or, earthly pursuits as opposed to the heavenly pursuit of Torah. Okay, let's complete this Mishnah, and the last one is kind of like a dessert, and I'm using that word intentionally. He used to say, one whose wisdom exceeds his deeds, and again, we're talking about the spiritual versus the physical, but also this is now more about like learning versus mitzvot. Is it better to be a scholar or a deeply wise rabbi or a person who is very active in doing good in the world? So one whose wisdom exceeds his deeds, to what may he be compared? To what may that one be compared? To a tree whose branches are numerous, but whose roots are few, so that when the wind comes, it uproots it and overturns it. As it is said, he shall be like a bush in the desert, which does not sense the coming of good. It is set in the scorched places of the wilderness, in a barren land without inhabitant. A wonderful quote from Jeremiah. So the idea here is that deeds are, in a sense, better than wisdom. If you're going to proliferate one over the other, you want your deeds to proliferate because that's what anchors your life. And wisdom is the offshoot, right? But if you are top heavy, if it's all up here, if you are like entirely in the land of the cerebral and you don't have your hands rooted in the doing, in the pursuit of a Jewish life, if you're not living the deeds, it will blow over or topple, because what roots a Jewish life is the stuff that you do. Maybe even further extended, all the wisdom in the world does not equal or compensate for a life bereft of good a life bereft of goodness, of derech eretz, right? So it's consistent with what we've read before, and you can see the counterpoint is here. But one whose deeds exceed his wisdom, to what may he be compared? To a tree whose branches are few, but roots are many, so that even if all the winds in the world come and blow upon it, they cannot move it out of its place. As it is said, he, this person, shall be like a tree planted by waters, sending forth its roots by a stream. It does not sense the coming of the heat. Its leaves are ever fresh. It has no care in a year of drought. It does not cease to yield fruit. So clearly the viewpoint, and there's a strong sense maybe in favor of, what really matters to this rabbi, to Rabbi Elazar, is human dignity, yes, but human action even more. Compassion, deeds that are transformative and bring goodness into the world are, for this rabbi, the far more substantive, and that you should found your life on being a good person even more than on accumulating wisdom. Thoughts on this? Again, I think this is this is much easier to unpack, even though it's a long Mishnah. Okay, so let's look at the last one, because this one it's a wonderful way to end our class and a wonderful way to end chapter 3 of Pirkei Avot. Let's do it in Hebrew to start. This is you're going to get a kick out of this one. Trish, I'm counting on you as a math lover to have something to say here. Okay, Rabbi Eliezer ben Chisma, different rabbi, not the same as Rabbi Elazar. This is Eliezer. And what do we know about this rabbi? Let's find out. You click on his name and here he is. Rabbi Eliezer ben Chisma, or Eliezer Chisma. Third generation Tana, one generation earlier than the guy we heard from in the previous Mishnah. Rabbi Elazar Chisma was a student of Rabbi Akiva, known for his brilliance as well as for his extreme poverty. When Rabban Gamliel of Yavna found out about his suffering, he promoted him. Okay, interesting. He does not have many teachings recorded in his name in Avot, but here they are. Rabbi Eliezer ben Chisma Omer, he says, Kinin ufitche nida hen gufei halachot. This is not an accidental repeat of the word hen, which means these. Let's translate. Rabbi Eliezer, I don't know why they don't have the ben in here. It should be Eliezer ben Chisma, but okay. Rabbi Eliezer ben Chisma says, the laws of mixed bird offerings and the key to the calculations of menstruation days, of a woman's menstrual cycle. These, yes, these are the body of the halacha. What the heck? This is not the spiritually elevated dramatic coda that many of you were hoping for at the end of chapter 3 of Avot, is it? Mixed bird offerings. Anyone want to venture a guess on what might be meant by mixed bird offerings?
A Thanksgiving turducken.
You know, on Goldbelly, you can order turducken. There are a couple of Cajun places that. Does everyone know what a turducken is? I've never had one. I've been just morbidly, and that would be the right word, curious about turducken. A turducken is a Thanksgiving self-contained poultry fest that is comprised of a chicken stuffed inside of a duck, stuffed inside of a turkey, with the bones removed, by the way. So you have a boneless chicken, whole but prepared, stuffed into the body of a duck, stuffed into a turkey, and then you slice through the whole thing. And usually there's like a cornbread stuffing in the layers in between. It's very elaborate. Julia Child had a recipe for something called the chicken melon. I think that they are distant cousins. Someday my dad can tell you all about adventures in chicken melon. But basically you take the chicken meat out of a chicken, but you have to preserve the skin intact. You take out all the meat and the bones, but you keep the chicken skin whole. And then you process the chicken meat with all sorts of delicious things so that it becomes like a pate. And then you stuff it back into the chicken skin and bake the whole thing and truss it up and slice it. It's very impressive. And you have 10 minutes of eating for 45 hours of work. Yeah, so a turducken is perhaps like a chicken melon on steroids. Audrey, do you want to take us into a more elevated line of conversation here? If so, please unmute yourself.
When you read the Hebrew, did you read the word kinim?
Kinim.
Like, is that the same as the plague?
It is not. False
Oh,
cognate.
okay.
Kinim in the plague, yes, good though, when you drop your blood from the wine cup onto the plate. Kinim, with a mem on the suffix, means lice.
Right, right.
Kinin, a kan is a small bird in Hebrew, and kinin in Talmudic Aramaic refers to various kinds of small birds. So probably not a turducken, where a bird within a bird within a bird that you eat on Thanksgiving, but probably more like a bunch of different small birds. Now, here's the gist of this Mishnah, because otherwise, why would a nice group of Menshi Reform Jews know anything about the laws of mixed bird offerings? Here's the point that I would bring up. There is an entire section of the Mishnah devoted to the laws or cases where one type of a bird offering accidentally gets mixed up with a different type of bird offering. For example, an obligatory offering becomes mixed up in a net or in a dovecote with a voluntary offering. Or maybe a sin offering of a pigeon got mixed up with a burnt offering of a different pigeon. There is actually a whole tractate of the Mishnah entitled Kinim that deals with these situations. Hold that thought. The second example that's given here is the calculations of menstruation days. So it was important in the Mishnaic time and in the rabbinic mindset to know how to calculate menstruation days so that a person could tell the difference, or a rabbi would know the difference between menstrual bleeding and other types of bleeding, which have different laws of marital purity that pertain differently. Much of the entire Mishnaic tractate called Nida is devoted to exactly these considerations of knowing how to calculate when a woman is menstruating. Why do we mention all of this? What seems to be my conclusion, what seems to be the conclusion one can draw, is that Kinin or Kinim and Nida are regarded as the most advanced rabbinic studies, right? If a young rabbi can master the laws of mixed bird offerings, and there's a whole tractate on these, and they're incredibly Byzantine and complicated. And if you can master the laws of calculating the days of menstruation and knowing the difference between what is menstrual bleeding and what is other kinds of bleeding, then you have achieved the highest levels of rabbinic mastery, and everything else would be relatively simple or simpler. Okay, so it's the highest, hardest level of rabbinic study. And he says here, this is the body of the halakha. In other words, this is the level of mastery that a young disciple of the tradition must strive to attain. And you start with the hardest stuff, or if you can reach the hardest stuff, then you learn everything else. If you can learn how to do menstruation cycles and mixed bird offerings, I'm trying to think, if you've ever been to med school, there must be like the course that like is just considered to be like the one that separates the men from the boys or the women from the girls, right? Advanced organic chemistry. Is it really applicable to your work every day? Probably not so much. But you know, I remember in 10th grade biology, the real men's to boys separator was memorizing the Krebs citric acid cycle. And you just had to know it. Like, I don't know, do people actually use the Krebs citric acid cycle every single day? Maybe they do. Maybe not. But it's just, we would think it is esoteric, useless knowledge. This rabbi believes it is essential knowledge because it's the high bar for how you learn how to be a rabbi. A real rabbi has to master these disciplines. And then
like in a pre-med course, it was more like, who's willing to do this to get to medical school? Like you said, it wasn't that you're going to use it every day, but it was, this is part of what the discipline, the need to memorize, the acquisition of arcana that you need to have if you're going to get there.
That's correct. Exactly. And speaking of arcana, the rabbi concludes on this note, and this will be the last thing we study today. The calculation of the equinoxes, so tikufot, that's the solar, that's astronomy, primitive, but astronomy, the gematriot, and gematria, which is derived directly from the Greek word for geometry, but usually refers to the arcane sciences of Jewish numerology and the numerical values assigned to Hebrew words and Hebrew letters. Some of you are familiar with different gematriot. We don't have to get into it. It's basically these two esoteric disciplines, astronomy on the one hand, geometry or gematria on the other, are what he calls parparot l'chochma. They are the desserts of wisdom. In other words, they would be what you enjoy learning after mastering the core discipline, which includes all the way up to the most arcane laws and rituals of menstrual cycles and mixed bird offerings. So do not be tempted by secular studies such as astronomy or mathematics, there it is, Trish, until you have mastered the most arcane and difficult disciplines within traditional halakha or Jewish law. And that's all she wrote. I wish you a wonderful 2 weeks. We do not convene on Veterans Day, so I hope you have a meaningful day off. We do convene on the 18th and then not on Thanksgiving, and then we resume during Hanukkah week. So I'll see you in 2 weeks. Take care. Bye-bye.